On the morning of January 20th, 1953, thousands gathered on the frozen Capitol grounds to witness the peaceful transfer of American power. But inside a limousine parked outside 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, something unprecedented was happening. The President-elect of the United States was refusing to follow a 164-year-old tradition. Dwight D. Eisenhower, the man who led the Allied forces to victory in World War II, sat stone-faced in that car, declining Harry Truman's invitation to step inside the White House for the customary pre-inauguration coffee. This wasn't just a breach of protocol. This was a public declaration of a feud so bitter, so personal, that it would freeze these two men in mutual contempt for nearly a decade. The question everyone was asking that frigid morning was simple. What could possibly have gone so catastrophically wrong between these two American icons? To understand that frozen moment, we need to rewind 3 years earlier to a time when these men were actually friends. In 1950, Dwight Eisenhower was the president of Columbia University, trying to settle into civilian life after decades in uniform. Harry Truman was in the White House, navigating the early Cold War and dealing with the nightmare of Korea. And here's what most people don't know. Truman didn't just respect Eisenhower. He idolized him. Truman offered Eisenhower everything. He tried to make him Army Chief of Staff. He wanted him to lead NATO. At one point, Truman even told Eisenhower that if he ran for president in 1948, Truman himself would step aside and run as his vice president. Think about that. A sitting president offering to become second in command to someone who'd never held elected office. That's how much Truman valued this man. And Eisenhower? He was gracious, respectful. He took the NATO job. He kept his politics private, insisting he was just a soldier serving his country. For years, nobody even knew if Eisenhower was Republican or a Democrat. Truman assumed, or maybe just hoped, that if Ike ever did run, it would be as a Democrat, as Truman's successor. But then came 1952, when Eisenhower finally declared his candidacy. He chose the Republican Party. Truman felt blindsided, betrayed even. But what came next turned disappointment into something much darker. The 1952 campaign became vicious, and not just because it was Republicans versus Democrats. Senator Joseph McCarthy was at the height of his power, destroying lives with accusations of communist sympathies. His recklessness was tearing the country apart. McCarthy had even attacked George Marshall, Eisenhower's mentor and the architect of the Marshall Plan, calling him part of a conspiracy so immense that it dwarfed anything in history. George Marshall was more than a colleague to Eisenhower. He was the man who'd elevated Ike from obscurity to supreme commander. Marshall had made Eisenhower's career possible. Everyone knew this. So when Eisenhower's campaign rolled into Wisconsin, McCarthy's home state, the moment of truth arrived. Eisenhower's speech was supposed to include a paragraph defending Marshall. A simple, powerful statement of loyalty. But as the train pulled into the station, that paragraph disappeared. Eisenhower stood on that stage and said nothing. He shared the platform with McCarthy, smiled for the cameras, and remained silent while his mentor's name was dragged through the mud. When Truman heard about it, something inside him snapped. This wasn't just politics anymore. This was about character, about loyalty, about honor. Truman had watched Eisenhower accept all the glory of the European victory, a victory that George Marshall had made possible. And now, when Marshall needed defending, Eisenhower chose political convenience over principle. Truman unleashed a fury that shocked even his closest advisors. He called Eisenhower a coward. He said the general had betrayed everything he claimed to stand for. In private letters, Truman's language was even harsher, words that can't be repeated in polite company. The man who once offered to be Eisenhower's vice president now considered him morally bankrupt. Which brings us back to that limousine on January 20th, 1953. Tradition dictated a specific ritual. The outgoing president would host the incoming president for coffee or tea in the White House. They'd chat pleasantly, pose for photos, then ride together to the Capitol for the inauguration. It was a symbol of American democracy, this peaceful transition. Washington and Adams had done it. So had every president since. But when Truman sent word that morning inviting Eisenhower inside, the response came back cold and clear. No, Eisenhower would wait in the car. Truman would have to come out to him. Imagine being Harry Truman in that moment. You've spent 8 exhausting years in the most demanding job on earth. You've made impossible decisions, dropped atomic bombs, stood up to Stalin, desegregated the military, fought a war in Korea. You've aged 20 years in 8. And now, on your final morning in office, the man taking your place won't even afford you the basic courtesy of entering your home. Truman had no choice. He walked out of the White House, climbed into that limousine, and sat next to Eisenhower in glacial silence. Secret Service agents later said the temperature inside that car felt colder than the January air outside. Neither man spoke. They stared straight ahead as the car rolled toward the Capitol, the crowd cheering, completely unaware of the hatred radiating between these two men. At one point, Eisenhower made a comment about the parade route. Truman's response was brief and icy. That was it. That was the extent of their conversation on one of the most important days in American democracy. After the inauguration, Truman returned to Independence, Missouri. He'd stay there for nearly a decade, building his presidential library and writing his memoirs. And in all those years, he and Eisenhower wouldn't speak a single word to each other. Think about that. Two men who'd shaped the 20th century, who'd worked together to defeat fascism and contain communism, now refused to occupy the same room. When presidential occasions required their attendance, organizers had to plan separate entrances. Former presidents and current presidents traditionally met, advised, consulted. Not these two. They existed in separate orbits, their mutual contempt never cooling. But here's what makes this story even more complicated. Neither man was entirely wrong. Truman wasn't wrong to be appalled by Eisenhower's silence on McCarthy. The failure to defend George Marshall was indefensible. History has judged that moment harshly, and rightly so. But Eisenhower wasn't wrong to be angry either. Truman had called him a coward, questioned his integrity, and attacked him with a personal viciousness that went far beyond normal political combat. Truman had portrayed him as a moral failure, and those wounds cut deep. Two proud men, both convinced of their own righteousness, locked in a feud neither could end without losing face. It would take the funeral of another president to finally break the ice. In November 1963, when John F. Kennedy was assassinated, Truman and Eisenhower found themselves at the same memorial service. Something about that moment, that shared grief for a young president cut down, finally made the past seem smaller. They shook hands. They exchanged a few words. It wasn't warmth, exactly, but it was something. An acknowledgement that life was short and grudges were heavy. That handshake came 10 years after the inauguration insult. 10 years of silence because two men valued pride over reconciliation. The story of that frozen limousine ride reminds us of something we often forget. History isn't made by monuments and marble. It's made by human beings with all our pettiness, our pride, our capacity to hold on to hurt. Eisenhower and Truman were giants of their era. They were also just two stubborn men who let their anger define a decade. On January 20th, 1953, Dwight Eisenhower refused to enter Harry Truman's White House. But the real tragedy wasn't that one morning. It was all the mornings that followed when forgiveness remained just out of reach, waiting behind the locked doors of wounded pride.